Thank you. That was a great song. Thank you so much. Karen Armstrong is a name that may be familiar to some of you. She's a British author who's written more than 20 books on the topic of religion, exploring what Islam, Judaism, and Christianity have in common, and how our faith shapes world history and drives current events. In 2008, Armstrong called for drawing up what she called a charter for compassion, a document that transcends religious, ideological, and national differences. Supported by leading thinkers from many traditions, the charter calls on us all to live with compassion, as epitomized in the so-called Golden Rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In an interview on CBC Radio at the time, Armstrong was asked a question about compassion. And I was really surprised and kind of saddened, to be honest, by her answer, because she responded by saying that a lot of people, both religious and secular, don't want to be compassionate. They want to be right. I'll come back to this in a minute. In our reading this morning from 1 Corinthians, Paul feels obliged to write to the church at Corinth, because apparently, according to the reading, and when you hear it read aloud, it almost sounds funny, because it sounds like there was a tattletale that told him about the dissensions and the quarreling that were taking place in that early Christian community. The church is so polarized and so divided that Paul is moved to ask, is Christ divided? Well, I guess it's an understatement to say that this was not the last time in the history of the church that the church has experienced divisions. Examples are all too easy to find in denominations like our own, in the United Church of Canada, and in others. John Sutherland Bonnell, in his Fifth Avenue sermons, tells us that the Church of God, in the Church of God, a branch broke off calling itself the true Church of God. And then there was another splinter that produced the only true Church of God. And when I read this, I thought it's probably not too much of a stretch of the imagination that another division might give birth to the only really, really honest to goodness, cross my heart and hope to die, true Church of God. And then there's another church I read about in Pennsylvania, I think it was, that has been split for ages because years ago, one group in the church wanted to have sauerkraut at a church dinner and another group didn't. And the two groups haven't spoken to each other since. I know there's not much middle ground on sauerkraut, but certainly we all have stories or have heard of stories or experiences that point toward this, what I'm going to call a human pathology of our need to be right. What lies behind this need to be right? What fear or insecurity engenders this kind of divisiveness? And it is about fear, I think. But fear of what? Is it a fear of the loss of self? Is it a fear of losing one's identity? I think that it is probably true of many of our relationships in life, whether it's our relationships with an institution like the church, or our intimate relationships with other people, our partners, our families, our friends, that we sometimes fear losing ourselves in a relationship. We fear losing our identity, not being sure of who we really are apart from that person or that institution. And if you're insecure about stuff like that, then I think we're more likely to build walls and make judgments about who is in and who is out. When we feel in danger of losing our identity, of losing ourselves, when we feel insecure about who we are, whether it's as a United Church person, for example, or simply as a Christian, then we need to be right. And in order for me to be right, someone else has to be wrong. And maybe this is why it's so difficult for us sometimes in the context of our faith to simply say, you know, this is my experience. This is true for me. And just leave it at that without telling others that they have to have the same experience and believe exactly the same things. Instead of the arrogance that gives rise to an I'm right, so you must be wrong kind of attitude, maybe we're called to a bit of humility, a bit of modesty, of acknowledging that our knowledge and our experience of truth is partial and limited. And this is what the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr meant when he said that we human beings, finite creatures that we are hemmed in by the necessities and limitations of natural existence. We're caught up and ruled by certain givens in life, things that we really can't change. We may like to believe that we as individuals or as a group collectively have the final word or the ultimate vantage point, when the truth is that no person and no group has that. But this is how factions arise. One party will start to glory in its angle on reality, and a partial, particular perspective will be absolutized and treated as though it were the ultimate. Another group will do the same thing with its slightly different point of view. So what are these limitations that we're talking about? Well, I can name three. First of all, consider the limitations of space. To state the obvious, I can't see everything. I can't be in more than one place at the same time. I'm constrained in what I can know and observe and appreciate by physical limitations. And as a consequence, all but a tiny, tiny little fraction of reality exists totally outside my small circle of awareness. Or consider the limitations of time. My time on Earth, even if I live to be 100 years old, is just a speck on the pages of history. Those events taking place during my lifetime have previous causes, many of which I'm only dimly aware of, and many more to which I'm completely oblivious. And the subsequent outcomes of those events in the future, long after I'm dead and gone, are similarly outside my circle of awareness. Add to these two the limitations of space and time, add material limitations. The letter to the Hebrews claims that what is seen was made out of what cannot be seen. If there are invisible influences, and of course there are at work in the world, whether they be atoms or angels, modesty requires that I confess that I see only the material result. And all of this is simply to say that I am a finite creature, subject to the limitations of human existence. Niebuhr says that our problem arises when we claim that we transcend those limitations more than is actually the case. Our partial perspectives would not be a problem, Niebuhr says, were it not for the fact that our egos take over and we claim total knowledge when in fact we have only partial knowledge. So as we heard in the reading this morning, the church at Corinth was polarized around particular personalities. There was Paul, and there was Apollos, and there was Cephas. One party even claimed that they had exclusive rights to the name Christ. Today, this would sound like, well, you're not really a Christian because you don't believe in the virgin birth or the divinity of Jesus, or that you haven't accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior. In the reading, rather than being flattered that people refer to the church of Paul, Paul wants nothing to do with it. Is Christ divided, he says? Or we might add, is faith divided? Is truth divided? Is God divided? The fault of the parties that Paul names is not that they say ours is the truth, but that they say ours is the only truth. And therefore, you're wrong. Yours is not the truth. The guilt of schism is when each party attacks others and denies that others are in the truth or have any truth at all. When individuals or groups act as though they have a monopoly on truth or a monopoly on God, then God is diminished. When arrogance and pride take over, then God is mocked. I read a quote this week in doing some research for this message and came across a quote by Dag Hammarskjöld. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that name, and I thought I knew who he was, but I had to look it up, and I'll just share it so we're all on the same page. Dag Hammarskjöld was a Swedish economist and diplomat, and I think the second General Secretary of the United Nations. And in his book called Markings, he wrote, "There is a pride of faith more unforgivable and more dangerous than the pride of the intellect." While Paul addresses the problem of divisions that have risen among Christian believers, I think that we're also called in the year 2024, especially living in a country like Canada, to examine our relationships not only with other Christian denominations and communities, but also our relationship with other faiths. And I know I talk about this a lot. And this is related to what I talked about 2 weeks ago about the universality of the gospel message. And I said 2 weeks ago that this is like a test to see if you remember, that in the last 30 years, the United Church has encouraged its people to engage with those of other faiths, to explore what we have in common with people of other faiths, and to learn about the ways in which we differ. And there have been at least 3 studies that have explored our relationship as Christians with people of other faiths. The first was called toward a renewed understanding of ecumenism. And that study encouraged us to see ecumenism in a broader, more inclusive way, not just as church-centered, but as world-centered. In other words, not just concerned about our relationships with people of other Christian denominations, but also concerned with our relationships with people of other faiths. It called on the Christian church in general and on us in the United Church in particular to continue to testify to the truth we believe, but to do so in a spirit of humility, with genuine respect for those people of other faiths and an openness to the insight, wisdom, and grace that God's unpredictable spirit has revealed through people of other religious traditions and those of no religious tradition at all. The second study was called Bearing Faithful Witness, United Church Jewish Relationships Today. And that's obviously about the relationship between the Christian church and the Jewish faith. And finally, there was a study, United Church Muslim Relations, called That We May Know Each Other. We need to get it through our noggins that religious zeal does not guarantee truth. Christians, therefore, these documents suggest, and I would support, should speak modestly when we speak, mindful of the dim glass through which every person looks. If we have a really good sense of who we are, if we're comfortable in our own skin as Christians, if we have a sense of identity about what we believe and what's important to us and what truth is for us, then it should not be too threatening to engage in a respectful and open dialogue with those whose beliefs are different from our own. And maybe, just maybe, we can let go of our need to be right. I hope so. Thanks be to God.